Chapter 10 deals on the nature of leadership. Leadership, as we talked about in Chapter 1, is a process by which people have the ability to influence others and get them to want to go along with what they're trying to get them to do for the benefit of the company. If you can inspire someone, if you can motivate someone, if you can give them a reason for following you, then being a manager or being a leader in a management position becomes a lot easier. You're not simply telling somebody that they have to do it or else because you're a manager and you have the ability to bring about negative consequences for not following you. If you can get people who willingly want to do the types of things that you're seeking, then it becomes a much easier process, and it's a much more positive process in terms of employee satisfaction. Within leadership, the leader is the person who exerts the influence or is able to control the influence that they exert over others in order to gain the objectives via their subordinates. Now, leaders come in a lot of different packages. There are some people that think leaders must be very gregarious and extroverted and outspoken, and many leaders are, and in fact, that kind of falls into a stereotype. But more important is understanding the nature of leadership and understanding the psychology that goes behind being a leader and why employees may want to follow someone. Different leaders, different managers will have different strengths and weaknesses. The most successful at least have some combination. Even if they don't have all of the best traits and all of the characteristics of a good leader, they are at least self-aware enough to know where they may have some shortfalls so that they can actually work their way around it. Some people really want to be in control. Some people are much more hands-off. Some people are very quiet by nature. Some people are very talkative and interpersonal. There's a whole lot of different ways that you can be a good, effective leader in a multiple array of different jobs. One of the types of leadership styles that they talk about is being a servant leader. This is a leader who really exists to make their employees' lives a little bit easier. You want to make sure that you work for the employee in order to get them what they need and to be in a position to succeed. Servant leader means that you are serving those that you are working with or who technically work for you. Managers and leaders have some level of power, which we'll talk about in another couple of slides. The servant leader exercises that power for the purpose of utilizing it for the benefit of their subordinates rather than to maybe self-glorify their own position or move on to a different higher level position. They don't bring a lot of attention to themselves. They really strive to make the people who report to them successful. As many different leadership styles as there could be from person to person, there are also a lot of different personal leadership styles. There are also many different leadership styles based on culture. At the risk of sounding somewhat stereotyped, the general consensus, and this is backed up by at least some studies, European managers are more people-oriented than American or Japanese managers. Japanese managers are more group-oriented. They also tend to have a more long-term focus. U.S. managers focus a lot more on short-term profitability. They're more likely to do layoffs and do things for the bottom line without really looking at the consequences necessarily of how it would play out in 5 or 10 years. Whereas Eastern managers, such as Japanese companies, they may be more cognizant of what the impact of what you do today could have on the business success in the future. As you go from culture to culture, if you have a job where you are stationed in a different country, you become an expatriate, you work in a foreign area, you will definitely notice the differences between the way businesses operate, the culture for the country in which that business is operating, and the management styles that are employed, because they typically reflect the culture not only of the people, but of the culture that those people are immersed in. The different type of management powers are established on this slide. They include expert power, referent power, legitimate, coercive, and reward power. So we're going to talk about each one of those. Legitimate power simply means that you have the authority to make managerial decisions. If you're the president or the CEO of a company, you obviously have very explicit legitimate power. You have the ability to hire and fire. You have the ability to make decisions. It is conferred upon you through a legitimate administrative process. There are other types of power here that can be exercised that do not necessarily need to flow through a legitimate power source. You could be the director of a department and have 10 or 20 people report to you ultimately. You may have legitimate power because you are in a position of authority that has been granted to you, and you can exercise that power because you're the boss. However, there are people who are subordinate to you that can also wield power who don't necessarily have any managerial skills. They have other types of power that we're going to talk about, such as referent power, where people believe that they're great at a level of expertise. So when they give advice, people are willing to listen and follow them, even if they don't have this conferred power upon them through the ultimate structure of the organization. Reward power typically comes from legitimate power, and it is the ability of a manager to withhold or give tangible or intangible rewards. If I think you're doing a good job, I can give you a bonus. I can create the bonus and give it to you. If you're not doing a particularly good job, I could not pay you the bonus. I could also take some type of punitive action against you by withholding pay, or maybe going into the punitive power, which is on the next page, coercive power. That's the ability to punish others. Reward power and coercive or punitive power typically come from the status of having legitimate power. As I said, you don't necessarily have to be conferred with a title in order to have legitimate leadership power, but to be able to have reward or coercive power, that typically does flow from a legitimate power source. Expert power comes from you being able to demonstrate that you have knowledge of a particular subject matter, you are good with a particular level of software, you have technical expertise, and you are able to share that in a way that other people respond positively to. They will defer to you, they will go to you as a source of expertise because you have demonstrated that. Now, again, unlike reward or coercive power, this does not necessarily have to come from legitimate power. Referent power comes from the idea of people who report to you respecting you, feeling a sense of loyalty because of the interactions that you've had with them in the past. That is basically, they're not doing something that you've asked of them because you have legitimate power. They're not doing it because they fear punishment or because they're seeking a reward. They're doing it because they respect you and they trust you and they take your word when you suggest that they should be doing something. These types of power are not necessarily self-contained. They cross over. You could have legitimate power, reward power, referent power. If you're an expert, you could basically wield all of these types of power, which would be a pretty well-rounded way of pursuing a management and leadership position. We talked about empowerment in Chapter 1. Again, that's when a manager is able to give to his employees some leeway to be able to make some decisions. If we are in like an accounting system where my accountants are doing audits, maybe they are able to purchase things for a particular amount of money, maybe up to $1,000. They don't have to come to me because they want to buy $80 worth of coffee for the office. I can basically just say, look, you don't need to come to me for everything. If it's just office supplies under $500, just make your best decision. And then it's up to them to be able to do it. You should train them and be sure that they're able to make these types of decisions without much involvement. But once they are trained on it and it's understood and explained to them appropriately, you can let them make their own decisions. If you're buying office equipment up to another amount, that's an easy way to give empowerment, to just say, you don't need to come from me for every single decision that gets made, only for the ones that fall into certain categories. In order to empower your employees, you have to have some form of legitimate power in order to delegate that authority to them. So if I have been given the authority to oversee the accounting department and an accounting subordinate reports to me, I can empower that employee to do certain things because I have the authority to do so. Empowerment does increase the manager's ability to get things done because if I've trained my employees to be able to do things on their own, it's going to do two things. They're not going to come to me for every single thing that needs to get done and ask me questions, which can bog down your ability to do other work. You always have to meet with people and discuss things and make decisions. If you can delegate that to other employees, it can make things work more efficiently. It also benefits the employees because rather than being told what to do like some kind of a robot, they are able to actually think about what they're doing and make strategic decisions as if they were a manager themselves. That can increase their job satisfaction and their commitment to the organization. And because you are delegating some authority to your employees, you can do more work on other areas. If you always had to make decisions for everything that came up with one of your employees, you're not going to be able to focus on solving other more important problems. The next slide talks about traits and behavioral models of leadership. Traits for leaders are basically just shorthand ideas about what a lot of good leaders share in terms of traits and background. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're missing one of these traits or one of the traits that are discussed in the text, that you're not going to be able to be a good manager. It's basically some researchers have done studies that showed what the most effective leaders look like, and they've tried to come up with a profile that would show what type of traits they share. Among the traits are intelligence, knowledge and expertise, dominance, self-confidence, high energy, tolerance for stress, integrity, honesty, and maturity. Now, intelligence and knowledge and expertise, that just simply means that you've got the intellectual capacity to make good decisions. You have knowledge, you can learn things, you can file those things away for future reference, you can think your way through problems and come up with good solutions by making good decisions. Dominance sounds a little bit strange, but it's really just essentially what type of leadership control you have. You don't need to be dominating your staff. It simply means that you have some level of authority over them. Managers typically need to have a high level of self-confidence. They need to be secure in their decisions and what they're doing. If they second-guess themselves, people will see pretty much right through that quickly, and they may not have a lot of confidence in that manager. High energy, I'm not doing jumping jacks when I'm at work. I'm not the most enthusiastic person, but you have to have energy for the work. You don't necessarily have to be a cheerleader, but you do need to be focused on the work and be able to spend enough time and energy to ensure that you're giving the attention that is needed to your staff. Tolerance for stress and also the tolerance for uncertainty is a big piece of being a manager. It can be a very stressful situation. If any of you have ever been in a job where you weren't a manager and then you were promoted to being a manager or a supervisor, the first thing that you notice is you went from just simply being one of the workers to being the person that all of the workers come to fix problems. It basically becomes the ability to assess situations and make decisions and make them well that really define whether or not a manager is going to be successful. There's a lot of stress related to it because if you make decisions and they're not working out particularly well, there can be pressure on a manager to be able to change their minds or to do the right thing in the first place. Integrity and honesty ties back to ethics and social responsibility. You don't want a manager that's basically throwing their employees under the bus, that are stealing their ideas, that are doing things that are either illegal, unethical, or immoral, especially if their employees are the ones that are able to judge that. If you work for someone that you don't respect, if you think is cutting corners, if you think is treating you unfairly, it's going to lead to a low level of satisfaction for that employee and probably a lot of the other employees who report to that manager as well. That can lead to high turnover because of dissatisfaction in the job, which costs a lot of time and therefore money because you're going to have to go out and find other employees to come in to substitute and backfill that position. The behavior model focuses on two types of behavior that leaders typically use to help influence their subordinates. The first is consideration. It is basically showing a level of respect, showing a level of empathy, that you care for your subordinates, that they're not simply cogs in the machine, but they are actually people. One of the things that I had to learn when I became a manager is that when someone's not doing a particularly good job at work, you have to maybe take a step back and find out why. Were they doing a good job before? Has something happened? You may discover that someone, they've got a relative that's sick, they're having health problems, there's other things that may be responsible for it. And rather than just jump into conclusions and being accusatory and telling someone that they're not doing a good job and simply leaving it at that, it's a good idea to just have discussions. You don't need to pry, you don't need to get into personal information, but making sure that you talk to people like they are people, that's a very important thing. And in the high pressure world of business, sometimes managers forget that. They just look at the bottom line, they just look at results, and they forget that the people that they depend on to get those results are still people, and they have issues and problems and like to be treated with respect, like to have an environment that is welcoming to them and to their ideas. Initiating structure is maybe the other side of the coin of consideration. Rather than taking into consideration the way people respond to interactions, it really is more towards the control function of being a manager. You want to make sure that they're doing their job correctly. You can have respect for someone and empathy for someone, but if the job isn't getting done, you need to be able to explain to them that it is not getting done and maybe have some type of course of corrective action so that they can do it correctly. It may be that they don't have the proper resources, they don't have the right equipment, they haven't had enough time. It could be that there's task or role ambiguity where they're not sure what was expected of them. You need to be able to talk all of that through. But ultimately, under the controlling function, you want to make sure that you create some type of a structure where people are able to perform their job at an acceptable level in order to ensure that the tasks that are being done are effective and efficient. Contingency models of leadership considers the fact that different people are different and different jobs present different circumstances. You may have someone that is a perfect manager for one type of job in a particular situation. They may not be a great manager in a different type of job in a different situation. Everybody has their personal preferences. Ideally, you get the great fit between manager and job and the culture of the organization that you're working for, and then it's the best way to have things play out in an effective manner. Sometimes, though, the job that you're working in is not necessarily a perfect fit for what your personal preferences are. Now, there may be some ability under the contingency model to focus on other aspects of your leadership and your management capabilities. One thing as a caveat that I will say right from the beginning is you don't necessarily want to pretend to be something that you're not. If you don't want to work for a particular company, if you don't like the behavior that they have, if you don't have a good match for their culture, trying to think your way through it, your employees will figure it out very quickly. Your peers will figure it out, and the people you report to will figure it out. So you want to make sure that you're not extending yourself so far that you don't come across as being a phony. You want to make sure that the efforts that you're making are within your capacity, within your capability to perform. Fiedler is a researcher that has done a lot of work on the contingency model, and they look at personal characteristics in terms of whether or not that's going to make someone an effective leader, and the leadership style regarding the manager's characteristic and their approach to leadership. So how does your personal characteristics impact your ability as a leader, and how does the style that results from that have an impact on your approach to leadership and maybe ultimately your success as a leader? Under the contingency model of leadership, we look at relationship-oriented leaders. These are the ones who are maybe more servant type of leaders. They focus on relations with their subordinates and they want to be liked by them. Being liked by your subordinates doesn't mean that you just have to let them do whatever they want. You still can be a manager. You can still seek control over them. You can still make sure that they're doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, but you don't necessarily have that as your sole focus. You still want to have a good relationship with your employees. Task-oriented leaders are much more focused on the control side of the work that's being done, and they are not necessarily focused on the relationship between them and their subordinates. They're more focused on the outcomes that their subordinates are able to produce and whether or not they meet the metrics that have been established as being minimally acceptable output. Leader-member relations looks at the extent to which the employees, the subordinates of a manager, of a leader, actually trust, like, and are loyal to their leader. When the leader says, I think we should do this, how likely are they to buy in and pursue the proper type of behavior that is expected? You could have some leaders that have poor qualities that the employees, the subordinates do not trust, do not like, and that can create kind of a cyclical negative feedback loop. Sometimes the only way around that is to change out the management, and it could be a challenge for the following manager to be able to establish that level of trust. Task structure relates to the ability of a leader to create a situation in which the subordinates clearly understand what they need to do. We talked about role ambiguity. I made a reference to it before. When you take a class in organizational behavior or in human resources management, it comes up there as well. Ambiguity is simply uncertainty. And if a boss tells you to do something and they're not very specific, that creates a level of stress, not necessarily on the manager, but on the employee, because the employee is not clear about what is expected of them. They don't know what types of things they should be doing. They don't know exactly what resources they should be tapping into to do it. So if you have a good, solid task structure, subordinates know what they need to do and they know how to do it. If you have a management structure that focuses on that, it's not at the expense of the relationship with your staff, but the staff definitely has a clear understanding of what is expected of them and how to be able to perform what they need to. Position power relates to a leader's level of power, and we talked about legitimate, reward, coercive power. These are the things that really flow from the authority of the upper echelons of the company. If you have legitimate reward and coercive power, you have a pretty solid basis from which to lead your subordinates. The next slide has a graphic that summarizes Fiedler's research conclusions. Again, this is not written in stone. This is what Fiedler came up with in terms of his analysis. And he basically came up with 8 different situations. And if you look at the graph here, the top one is, do you have good or poor leader-member relations? If you have good leader-member relations, it's basically the left side of the graph that applies to it. If you have poor leader-member relations, it's the right side. The next is the task structure. And again, the task structure relates to the level that employees understand what is expected of them, clarity of mission, full understanding of what they are required to be doing to fulfill the requirements of their job. You could either have a high level of task structure or a low level of task structure. And then the last part is position power. So, for example, if you have good leader-member relations, if you have a high level of task structure, that means you're getting along with your employees, they understand what they're supposed to be doing, and if you have a strong position power, you're in a really good position, and that is very favorable. That is the first category of the 8 that Fiedler came up with. If you happen to be a leader who is really focused on tasks, then the first 3 categories here are the 3 that you will probably perform the best, because you've got good relations with your employees. Even if the task structure isn't that particularly good, if you're in a strong position of power, that's the first 3 categories, we'll cover that, it should be a reasonably good opportunity for someone who's focused on tasks. If you're a manager who is more of a relationship-oriented leader, you would be most likely to be successful in categories 4, 5, 6, and 7. In addition, the task-oriented leaders would also be pretty good in the least favorable or the most unfavorable situation, which is category 8. I don't want to spend a bunch of time on this, but make sure you just take a peek at it and have a basic understanding of the different combinations that may apply. In certain situations, there may be good relationships, there could be good or bad task structure. There's a lot of variables that are important to acknowledge. Rather than memorizing this particular chart, I think the point of the chart is to show you that there's a lot of variability that can apply to a given managerial situation. And a good manager will understand and recognize that it's not always going to be a one-size-fits-all situation. House was another researcher that looked into management and leadership. A lot of these, whether it's Fiedler or House or any of the other principles that they're reviewing, there may be some level of crossover and they touch upon familiar themes. House's claim to fame was the path goal theory, and he basically said that effective leaders clearly identify the outcomes that they're trying to obtain. Again, you want to avoid role ambiguity, make sure people understand what they're supposed to be doing, rewarding workers who perform at a high level of performance. They get bonuses, they are acknowledged, and then you clarify the paths to the attainment of the goals. It's a little bit more like a part 2 of the identification. You want to identify the outcomes, but if people understand how you get to that outcome and the steps that they need to take, the people they need to talk to, the resources they might need to be able to access, that's going to be fundamental to employees being able to succeed. House's path goal theory also included an examination of directive behaviors. This is a manager setting the goals, assigning the tasks, letting people know how to complete them. Again, this is really based on that lack of ambiguity, making sure everything is clear, and then looking out for their best interests, making sure that, again, they're just not a cog in the machine, that you're giving them all the information that they need, and then you're supporting them in a way that's going to lead to them to being able to be successful when pursuing the behavior that they've been directed to perform. Participative behavior is another way of saying empowerment. So like I said, there's a little bit of crossover here. Letting subordinates have a say in matters that affect them, whether you delegate authority to them, whether you give them a little bit of power, whether you allow them to come up with ideas for resolving problems and letting them run with it rather than constantly overseeing everything that they do. One thing about achievement-oriented behavior is that when you set goals, you have to be cognizant of the fact that they can't be so far out of the realm of possibility that people will never think that they can achieve them. They also can't be so simple that people will think that it's kind of silly and that they end up getting bored with it. A challenging goal is something that is maybe just outside your comfort area, that you have to focus on, that you have to take additional steps, that you can't just do it on autopilot. But it can't be something so out of the ordinary that an average employee would think that they never had any opportunity to do it. If an employee thinks that there is a goal that is so challenging that they won't be able to accomplish it, chances are they're not even going to attempt to accomplish it. Leader substitutes model is basically something that can replace actual authority or the actual influence of a leader. Substitutes for leadership can include the characteristics of the people working there. If you have a really self-motivated person who has the skills and knowledge and experience, and they are really motivated, they take their job seriously, you can basically just have them work and the manager can be on autopilot. They basically manage themselves. If you can find those employees, I recommend strongly hiring them. I've had a few, and it's a pleasure to have them working on your staff. The other thing is that if you have work that you can give to people, and it's fun work, it's interesting work, it's challenging work, but more importantly, it's a good match for the employee that you have working there. They find it fun, they find it interesting, they take it important. If they are the type of person that is self-motivated and they're doing something that they see as pleasurable, it's going to be really easy to oversee their work. You're not going to have to really do a lot to inspire them. You're not going to have to do a lot to manage them, to be able to double check their performance. It doesn't mean that you don't have to do any work. It just means that it's a lot more effective and efficient for a manager when you have people working for you that you don't have to exert a lot of time and influence on trying to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. You still have to go through the basic controlling factors to ensure that the work is getting done, but you don't have to necessarily devote as much time to them as you do for other employees. Transformational leadership refers to leaders who are able to make the subordinates aware that their job is important. Sometimes when companies get caught in a rut, it's because people don't really have a big picture of what they do. There's a likely apocryphal or untrue story, but it's still a good story, so I'm going to share it because the point is valid. In the 1960s, when NASA was getting ready to put a man on the moon, they had the president go to Houston, where the Space Center was located, and he went around and he talked to the engineers and the astronauts and the people who do the telemetry and the communications, and he was asking everybody what they do, what is your job, and they would explain it to him. And then as the president was walking by a janitor pushing a broom, he said, what is your job here? And the janitor said, we're putting a man on the moon. Now, he could have said, I'm just keeping the place clean, I'm emptying the trash. The answer reflects the idea that this employee, even if it was just a janitor, knows that if he didn't do his job, then everybody else wouldn't be able to do their job appropriately. And you may have difficulty for the engineers and the astronauts and everybody else to be able to do the ultimate goal. Everybody's job should be important if you design the process correctly, and everybody has a role to do. Sometimes, however, you kind of get caught up in just doing the work and putting your head down, and you don't really know if it makes any difference. Transformational leaders are the ones who make sure that their employees understand how important their roles are, even if in the big scheme of things, they're not particularly high up on the organizational chart. You have to make sure that they understand that the work that they are doing is important. When you understand that your work is important and part of the bigger picture, it becomes easier to become motivated. Transformational leaders will also encourage their employees to expand their horizons, take training, go back to school, maybe try different jobs, be willing to undertake different tasks to see if that challenges them, to see if other things interest them. And they also motivate workers who work for the good of the organization and not just themselves. That's very much tied to the first point that we were making about the importance of your job. If you understand that the job that you do, maybe you don't even care about it that much, or maybe you're only doing it so you can get a paycheck or to get a good rating on your job performance so that you can get a promotion. But the best employees are the ones who recognize that they're not just working for themselves. Those people are typically kind of transparent, and you can tell who they are. It's the ones who are dedicated to the company, to the employee, to the objectives and the mission of the organization. It kind of takes care of itself in terms of their personal reward, because others will acknowledge it and then put them in a position where they might be able to step up and get promoted and be acknowledged for their work. The next slide talks about being a charismatic leader. Again, you don't necessarily have to be a cheerleader if you're not the most extroverted, confident person in the world, if you're not really great at small talk and holding an audience captive with your ability to speak. That doesn't mean that you can't be a good leader. It doesn't even mean you can't be a charismatic leader. If you are enthusiastic for the job, at least in the context of what you consider to be enthusiastic, it will rub off on other people, and other people will acknowledge it and notice it. If you're self-confident, you are able to communicate. You don't have to necessarily be the best at it. You just have to be understanding that that's one of the things that you need to do as a leader. And it's the type of thing that you could always get better at, even if it isn't one of the things that you're particularly strong at. Another thing is stimulating employees intellectually. This is related to empowerment, making sure that a leader is able to get them interested in different things, to understand how the bigger picture works. If people are more interested in the big picture, they may take a greater interest in the smaller portion of it that they're focusing on. You can also make sure that they have training and development opportunities made available to them, because some of the better employees may also prove to be one of the better managers later on. It serves the interest of the company to keep people stimulated intellectually and to have the opportunity to develop their skills to potentially move into positions of higher authority. That will pay off in the long term because you'll be able to retain people that are interested in the job and are to be high performers. Transactional leadership is not typically viewed favorably in terms of leadership styles. It doesn't really fall under that transformational leadership category that we were just discussing. Transactional leaders basically motivate subordinates because they hold the purse strings and they can give you money if you perform well, or they can punish you or fire you or withhold something if you perform badly. That's why it's transactional. You do something, you get money. You do something bad, you don't get money. Most people are not motivated particularly strongly by transactional leadership, except maybe for the most basic of jobs. If you are someone who went to college and wants to do a good job and you're in a transactional relationship with your boss, you're probably not going to have a lot of respect for your boss. You probably will experience lower levels of satisfaction, and it might be the type of job that you would probably want to get out of, which means it would be bad for the organization. Organizations sometimes do rely on transactional strategies, and by nature, I mean, if you have a job, you're getting a paycheck. So it is transactional at the very core. But if it's limited to only being purely transactional, you're missing a lot of opportunity to develop people, to get them committed to the organization, to keep them happy, and to give them a reason to be retained and to keep their job. The next slide covers gender and leadership. There are a majority of women in college today, and it has been that way for some time. Most college graduates are actually women. Some colleges are 2-to-1 in terms of the distribution of men to women. However, there are still a lot of stereotypes that are applied to women. They are not viewed as being focused on tasks. They are not viewed as being bottom line, getting the job done. When in reality, a lot of the research that has been done and a lot of the reporting shows that men and women typically are equally effective leaders. They may have different strategies and styles, and it may be somewhat based on gender, but it could also just be based on different personalities. Men could perform as some of the women do, and some women may act like some of the men do. It's really hard to put everybody in a box and say you're going to do one thing because you belong to a particular gender. Women also typically get paid much less for doing similar jobs. And even though women are the majority of college graduates over the last few years, only a fraction of them have the highest level positions at the biggest companies. That is something that is slowly changing, but it's probably a little bit too slow to be justified by the performance that is being measured, where, as I said, men and women are almost indistinguishable in terms of their performance ultimately. Emotional intelligence in leadership is important. The leaders should be cognizant of the mood that they're in. When I teach organizational behavior and design, we talk about something called emotional contagion. If you're in a bad mood, you act in a way that maybe sours other people, and then they go and treat other people with a bad mood, and it spreads, and then all of a sudden everybody's really annoyed with everybody else. It also works the other way. If you're in a good mood and somebody's in a bad mood and you kind of lift them out of it, then they're going to be able to interact with other people in a more positive note. Interestingly enough, when groups are studied and the leaders have positive moods, they work better together as a group. The positive mood meaning that they are maybe more capable of having interpersonal skills. They're more willing to listen to other people. However, when leaders experience negative moods, they work harder. Working harder is not necessarily a bad thing, but working harder without that coordination is potentially problematic, because if you have a team and they're all individually working stronger because they maybe are fearful of somebody with a negative mood, that doesn't necessarily mean that the team will be working better. Leaders should also have a high level of emotional intelligence. You don't need to be an armchair psychologist, but just having an idea about why people might respond to conversation the way that they do, how to approach discussing difficult subject matter. If you've got someone that's not performing well, you don't want to just come right in and say, you're doing a terrible job, what's the matter with you? You have to be able to read people to be able to understand how well they accept the type of information that you're providing to them. If you are able to understand the appropriate way to treat people, and people vary quite differently from employee to employee. One way of talking to one employee may not be necessarily suitable for the way that you might want to talk to another. Again, you don't want to be able to put on airs and pretend that you're something that you're not. You don't want to be a tough talker if you're not, and you think that an employee would respond to that. However, you have to have some level of emotional intelligence to be able to anticipate why people would respond in a particular fashion so that you can anticipate problems before they arise by making missteps. And that's the end of chapter 10.